Does she even understand a word we're saying? Victor Lang's voice carried a polished cruelty, the kind that wore a smile while cutting flesh. Beside him, Damon Cross chuckled, tilting his wine glass as if the ruby liquid inside held the punchline. Across the table, Akiko Mori did not flinch. She sat with the posture of a queen carved from stone, her jade ring glinting faintly under the chandelier. She answered their arrogance with silence, her eyes fixed on the city lights outside the vast window. That silence was not weakness. It was a mirror, forcing them to hear only themselves. They didn't realize how loud their contempt had become. I was there, but not there. Nora Hayes, a waitress, trained to vanish in plain sight. My hands refilled their glasses, cleared their plates, but my ears caught everything. I had lived 15 years in Kyoto. To me, Akiko's words in Japanese were not noise, they were music. Measured, deliberate, carrying meanings far deeper than the neat, stripped-down translations Kenji Ito provided. I could hear what the men could not, the questions sharpened like scalpels, the quiet disappointment wrapped in velvet. Victor slid a leather folder across the table. $500 million, simplified. Sign tonight, and we all win, Damon smirked, adding, if she can't speak the language, she surely can't lead a company. My pulse quickened. The insult was so naked it stung my own skin. Akiko's gaze shifted slowly from the window to me. For the briefest moment, I saw it. Loneliness, dignity, a question trembling unsaid. Is there no one here who sees? And then I knew. Silence had gone on too long. Someone had to answer. Have you ever mistaken silence for weakness? Or wondered what hidden power waits behind words you cannot understand? The private dining room of Luminara was designed to impress, its polished mahogany walls gleaming under the chandelier's frozen light, its vast window framing Manhattan's skyline like a god's canvas. But for those seated inside, the beauty only deepened the tension. Victor Lang, with his silver hair sculpted to perfection, looked every inch the man who had spent decades treating the world as a balance sheet, his smile thin, his eyes cold, always searching for leverage. Damon Cross, younger, sharper, his navy suit cut like a weapon, played the role of eager protege, his laughter loud, his ambition louder, believing speed and arrogance were the same as intelligence. Across from them sat Akiko Mori, her posture as straight as a sword in its sheath, her charcoal silk dress simple, unadorned, her jade ring the only ornament, and yet she commanded the room without a single word of English. She was dignity embodied, silence honed into an instrument. At her side, slightly behind, was Kenji Ito, her aide, translating with precision but without soul, his words efficient but stripped of the subtle honorifics, the layered meanings, the veiled challenges and courtesies embedded in Akiko's speech. He was doing his duty, but duty had become a wall, and on the other side, Victor and Damon mistook emptiness where there was in fact depth. And I, Nora Hayes, moved along the edges, clearing plates, refilling water, trained to be invisible, yet unable to unhear what was said and unsaid. For 15 years in Kyoto, I had lived in a language that taught me how silence could be warmer than words, how a bow could carry more weight than a speech, how the way one phrased disappointment could slice sharper than anger. I recognized Akiko's cadence immediately. Her questions about Victor's Caribbean trip were not polite curiosity, but subtle accusations. Her reference to Damon's stock drop was not a note of pity, but a disappointed teacher correcting a reckless student. And yet Kenji's English trimmed these meanings to bones, leaving only bare fact. The men grew restless, mistaking the slow rhythm of honor for inefficiency, mistaking refinement for weakness. Damon leaned close to Victor, his whisper too loud to be discreet, wondering if this was some kind of power play, some stunt to force them to beg. Victor counseled patience, masking his own irritation, assuring him that $500 million was worth enduring a little theater, but I could see the cracks in his composure, the tightness of his jaw, the tremor in his fingers as he swirled his wine. They believed they were circling a wounded prey, but the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Akiko was watching them, not their words, but their reactions, measuring their character in the silence they thought was theirs to control. And I stood there with a tray balanced on my palm, knowing every nuance, every sting hidden in her Japanese, my heart tightening because I could see the unfolding disaster more clearly than anyone else in the room. Victor and Damon thought they were hunters, but they were already being judged, and the verdict would not be written in English. Damon Cross's patience snapped first, the way glass fractures with a hairline crack before shattering, and he leaned forward with a smirk that carried more contempt than courtesy, speaking slowly and loudly as if Akiko Mori were a child or deaf. "We are offering you a very good price. Lots of money," he said, waving his fingers in mock emphasis, and the words made my stomach twist because they were not just insulting. They were a betrayal of every unspoken rule of respect I had been raised with in Kyoto, where tone and posture mattered as much as meaning. Kenji Ito translated dutifully, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to betray emotion, and Akiko answered softly, her Japanese layered with weary grace. And when he rendered it in English, it became the flat phrase, "Miss Mori understands the financial offer." But what she had truly said was closer to, "Please tell this child that the buzzing of a fly is more disruptive to my thoughts than his shouting." I almost dropped the pitcher in my hand, my heart hammering, because in that moment I realized the dinner was no negotiation, it was disintegration. A $500 million bridge burning plank by plank in front of men, too arrogant to see the smoke. Victor Lang tried to steady the theater, but even he grew careless, whispering to Damon across the table about cutting performance incentives, stripping value from Akiko's executive team, and saving millions she would never notice. They spoke as though she were furniture, not a human being, forgetting that silence is never absence, only waiting. My manager's rule pulsed in my head. You are invisible. You do not speak. But I could feel Kyoto rising in my chest. Every classroom, every temple courtyard, every lesson in humility and honor. I saw Akiko's eyes glisten not with anger, but with a deep, almost grandmotherly sadness. The kind of grief that comes when you realize respect has been abandoned for profit. Damon's arrogance grew louder. Victor's mask cracked thinner, and the room was filled not with conversation, but with the stench of hubris. I felt my hands tremble, not from fear of them, but from the injustice spilling across the table like spoiled wine. And then Akiko murmured, almost to herself, "Is there no one here who sees?" Words Kenji did not translate. Words meant for no one, yet they pierced me like an arrow. That was the moment the decision was made, not by calculation, but by conscience. I could no longer be a shadow, no longer be a pair of silent hands clearing dishes. I had to answer. I smoothed my apron, took a step forward, and in that step, I crossed the line between invisibility and defiance. The carpet muted my footfall, but inside my chest the drumbeat was deafening. I stopped at her side, bowed deeply from the waist, not the shallow nod of service, but the formal gesture of reverence reserved for elders and teachers, a bow I had not performed in years, and the room fell into stunned silence. Damon's smirk froze, Victor's pen stopped mid-note, and Akiko's eyes widened with something fragile and luminous. Recognition. I straightened, met her gaze, and spoke in flawless Kyoto dialect, my voice steady, my resolve unshaken. "Mori-sama, forgive my intrusion. I am but a servant here, but to remain silent in the face of such discourtesy is dishonor. If you permit me, I will speak for you." And with those words, everything changed. The silence that followed my words was not empty, it was charged, a thundercloud hanging over the polished mahogany table. And for the first time all evening, Victor Lang and Damon Cross seemed uncertain of the script that they had been following. I could feel their eyes on me, sharp with disbelief, as though a chair had suddenly spoken, as though a candle flame had dared to burn in daylight. Akiko Mori, however, looked at me with a softness that undid me. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and in them I saw gratitude, relief, and something deeper, a recognition that I had understood her, not just her words, but her heart. Victor broke the spell first, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What is this, a performance? Can we get more wine instead of riddles?" Damon barked a laugh, but it faltered halfway, because Akiko's posture had shifted ever so slightly from passive patience to commanding presence, and she raised her hand with a grace that silenced even their mockery. Kenji Ito's composure cracked for the first time as he looked between us, his eyes wide, realizing that the invisible waitress had just stepped into his role, and perhaps even surpassed it. My bow had been more than etiquette. It had been a declaration that I saw Akiko as she was meant to be seen, not as prey, but as sovereign. I could still hear my manager's voice echoing in my skull. You are invisible. You do not speak. But I had already broken that law, and the world had not ended, though it trembled. I drew breath and repeated, in the dialect of Kyoto, humble yet strong, Mori-sama, forgive me, but if you wish, I will translate faithfully, without omission, without disrespect. The words left my lips like a bell tolling across a valley, and the reaction was seismic. Victor's jaw clenched, Damon's smirk collapsed into confusion, and Akiko's lips parted, a small, strangled sound escaping her throat, as though she had been holding back a storm for months, and now, finally, the first drops of rain had fallen. She spoke, her voice trembling yet elegant, a cascade of Japanese that poured like water over dry earth. I listened with my whole body, my whole memory, each syllable recalling playground games in Kyoto, my father's careful lessons about honor, my grandmother's lullabies, and I translated slowly and deliberately her message to the room. She was not weak. She was not confused. She was not lost. She was a woman carrying the weight of an empire she had built, and she demanded to be treated as such. Victor tried to interrupt, waving his hand dismissively, but the room no longer belonged to him. The chandelier seemed to shine for Akiko. The silence bent itself around her, and even Damon, reckless Damon, stayed his tongue. Akiko's words through me became a blade honed to a single edge, cutting away the lies, the condescension, the casual cruelty. She spoke of respect, of dignity, of the centuries-old tradition that silence is not ignorance, but consideration, that patience is not passivity, but strength. As I translated, I watched their faces, saw how shame warred with greed, how disbelief collapsed into unease, and I knew something had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer a ghost at the edge of their banquet. I was the voice they had ignored, now made impossible to deny. And in that moment, as Akiko reached for my hand beneath the table, her touch light but anchoring, I realized the balance of power had tilted. The hunters had become the hunted, and all it had taken was a waitress daring to bow and speak. The truth unfolded like a curtain pulled back from a stage, revealing not weakness, but resilience. And Akiko Mori, through my voice, began to share the reality the men across the table had never considered. 6 months ago, she had been in a car accident on a rainy Tokyo street, the tires screeching, the world spinning into darkness. And when she awoke, she discovered her brilliant mind intact, yet bound by invisible chains. The trauma had fractured the part of her brain that commanded English under stress, leaving her native Japanese as her refuge. I translated carefully, my words steady though my chest trembled, telling Victor Lang and Damon Cross that the woman they had mocked was not playing a game, not enacting some foreign ritual, but struggling daily with expressive aphasia, a condition cruel in its specificity. She could understand every word in English, could read contracts, could absorb data, but when pressure rose, the foreign tongue dissolved into mist. She was trapped in silence, not by choice, but by the betrayal of her own brain. And yet she had come here tonight not to beg, but to test the men who sought to own her life's work. Victor blinked, his mask of sophistication trembling, and Damon snorted, unable to contain his disbelief. Why wasn't this disclosed? We've wasted our time, he barked, his voice accusatory rather than compassionate. Akiko's eyes hardened, her next words sharp as a blade, and I delivered them without softening. Dignity is not a line item in a quarterly report. The weight of those words dropped like stone into water, ripples shaking the table itself. I could see their arrogance shrinking, but also mutating, twisting into something darker, because men like Victor and Damon did not learn humility. They calculated weakness in search for leverage. Victor leaned forward, his voice syrupy with feigned sympathy, telling her they wanted to help, that this revelation made matters simpler, that they could expedite the deal, handle the details, free her from burdens she need not carry. Damon joined in, his mock concern dripping from every syllable, urging that they sign a letter of intent that very night for her own good, smoothing the way so she could recover without worry. I translated their words, but inside I recoiled, because I saw the gleam in their eyes, not compassion, but predation, sharks circling a wounded figure. Akiko listened, her face serene but her gaze filled with an ancient disappointment, the look of someone who had witnessed this dance of exploitation too many times before. The air in the room thickened, predatory opportunism replacing the earlier arrogance. And I realized with sudden clarity that this was not merely negotiation, it was a battlefield. And the stakes were not dollars, but legacy, respect, and the soul of a company she had poured her life into. My pulse raced as I stood between two worlds, the calculated cruelty of men in suits and the dignified sorrow of a woman whose silence had been misunderstood. I remembered my father's lessons in Kyoto, that silence could be armor, that restraint could be a sword, and I understood now that Akiko's silence was not surrender, but a crucible, a test of character. And these men were failing spectacularly. Still, they pressed on, sliding a revised contract toward her, leather-bound and heavy, its pages glistening with legalese crafted to suffocate truth. I watched it land with a thud, a sound that carried more menace than generosity, and I realized that they saw her not as a partner but as a liability, a chance to strip and sell, to devour rather than build. My hands trembled as I reached for the document at Akiko's subtle gesture, the weight of it colder than any silver tray I had ever carried. And as I opened it, the words blurred into a labyrinth of clauses and traps. I knew little of corporate law, but I knew deceit when I saw it, and the moment I began to read aloud in Japanese, translating line by line for Akiko, I felt Victor and Damon's eyes on me, impatient, eager to skip the inconvenient details. Their plan was simple: drown her in complexity, then swoop in with false kindness, claiming rescue while stealing everything of value. But Akiko was no fool, and now she had me. The pages of the contract felt heavier than paper, each clause a stone designed to sink Mori dynamics into the depths of someone else's control. And as I read aloud in Japanese, translating every line for Akiko Mori, I felt my own voice sharpen with purpose, no longer timid but anchored in outrage. Clause 7b, buried under layers of jargon, was not the harmless indemnity language Victor Lang claimed, but a hidden blade granting unilateral rights to renegotiate all of Mori Dynamics' intellectual property licenses, effectively giving them power to strip and sell her patents like scraps at a market. When I exposed this, Damon Cross shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering, sweat glistening at his temple. Akiko's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curving into something that was not a smile, but a recognition that their trick had been seen, and she gave me the smallest nod, urging me onward. Section 12 followed, which Damon, I reminded myself, had waved off as redundancy protocols, but as I unraveled its language, I saw the truth. It was a non-compete clause so broad it would ban not only her executives, but Akiko herself from working in any technological field for 10 years. 10 years, a lifetime for innovation, a theft of future rather than present, and I felt my pulse thunder as I said aloud in Japanese, "They are not buying your company, Mori-sama. They are buying your life." Victor tried to interject, raising his voice in false exasperation, insisting these were standard agreements. But I met his gaze and replied in English, formal and unyielding. "Clarity is paramount in a deal of this magnitude, Mr. Lang." And the shock on his face at hearing corporate language from a waitress was almost satisfying. The contract shook in my hands, not from fear but from adrenaline, and I pressed on. Akiko posed her own question in Japanese, deceptively gentle. Where was the valuation of the R&D division that had been pegged at $100 million in the initial draft? I translated, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Damon dismissed it as a clerical simplification, claiming it was all in there. But Akiko's eyes gleamed with quiet steel, and I delivered her reply word for word. When a number of that size vanishes, it is rarely clerical. Their frantic rustling of papers betrayed them, their control crumbling as they searched for a justification that did not exist. For the first time all night, Victor looked old, his silver hair no longer regal but brittle, his hands trembling as he flipped through his copy. Damon's earlier bravado drained, leaving only panic etched on his face. Akiko sipped her tea calmly, every motion a declaration of control, and in that moment I realized she had always known the contract's traps, always understood the deceit. She needed me not to read the words, but to bear witness, to make visible their dishonor. The revelation struck me like lightning. This entire dinner had been a test, not of financials, but of integrity. And the men across the table had failed in ways so glaring they could never recover. The chandelier's crystals glistened as if mocking them. The silence now turned hostile, their whispered schemes exposed to light. Then Akiko spoke again, her tone transformed, no longer soft and courtly, but crisp, commanding. The voice of the CEO who had conquered a male-dominated industry, and her instructions were precise, devastating. I straightened, turned to Victor and Damon and said, "Mori-sama has reached her decision." The words hung in the air like the toll of a bell, and both men froze, their eyes wide, realizing the performance was ending and the curtain was about to fall. I let the silence stretch, a blade hovering before the strike, before continuing. She finds your attempt to bury the intellectual property clause a blatant insult, your non-compete an act of delusional arrogance, and your disappearance of the R&D valuation a theft of her life's work. Damon looked as though I had struck him across the face. Victor's lips parted, but no words came. And just as their panic reached its crescendo, Kenji Ito, who had been silent for so long, placed a digital recorder on the table and pressed play. Their own voices spilled into the room, every whisper of deceit, every smug plan to cheat her echoing back at them, damning and undeniable. The room was transformed, no longer a dining hall, but a courtroom, and they had just heard their own confession. The recording ended, and the silence that followed was heavier than stone, pressing down on Victor Lang and Damon Cross until their shoulders sagged under the weight of their own treachery. Their faces, once smug with certainty, were pale and hollow, as though the chandelier above had stolen their color. Then Akiko Mori leaned forward, her voice rasped, fragile yet crystalline, and in perfect English, she whispered, "This negotiation is over." The words rang like thunder in a chapel, stunning in their clarity, shattering the illusion of weakness they had built around her. She rose from her chair with quiet dignity, Kenji Ito steadying her as though he were her shadow, and with a final nod to me, a gesture of gratitude deeper than any contract, she left the room. The door closed softly, but to me, it was the loudest sound I had ever heard, the sound of careers collapsing and of a legacy preserved. I stood frozen, the weight of what had transpired anchoring me to the carpet, knowing my own life had just been upended. Fired, perhaps, blacklisted, certainly, yet also lifted in a way I could not yet name, into a world where I had spoken truth when silence would have been easier. I looked at the abandoned contract, the glasses half empty, the silverware gleaming uselessly, and I realized the battlefield was not marked by blood, but by dignity, and Akiko had won. Outside, the city lights shimmered as though they, too, bore witness. For a long moment, I simply breathed, tasting relief and fear in equal measure, before following the path her footsteps had carved for me. Have you ever underestimated someone because they were silent? Because they wore a uniform? Because you thought their place was beneath notice? Tonight proved how dangerous that mistake can be. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it waits in silence. Sometimes it serves water. Sometimes it bows before speaking. But when it finally speaks, it can change everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes silence is weakness. What about you? Have you ever seen someone invisible reveal their true power? Tell us in the comments.